December 19th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. -12 degrees. A white cloth tied to a bare branch marked the spot where 17 men lay in the snow. Private First Class Eddie Malone held one morphine syrette in his frozen fingers. One dose left. 12 American wounded behind him begged for relief. 5 German soldiers lay in front. 2 still breathing. The morphine syrette was a small single-use pain injector about the size of a toothpaste tube. Eddie's hands shook. Not from cold, from the choice. His medic training said treat the worst injury first regardless of uniform. His squad said let the enemy suffer. The German boy with the stomach wound had maybe 10 minutes before shock killed him. Eddie's own men had hours, maybe a full day. The snow fell harder. Radio silence meant no resupply for at least 18 hours. What would you do with 1 dose and 17 dying men? Eddie closed his eyes. 3 days ago he had carried 60 morphine syrettes in his medical bag, each one a small tube of mercy, each one a promise that pain could be controlled. 3 days ago he thought he understood war. He had studied the manual. He had practiced the techniques. He had memorized the protocols. 3 days ago the Ardennes Forest was just another assignment. A quiet sector, a place to rest before the next push. Then the Germans attacked. The morning of December 16th started with something Eddie would later recognize as false peace. The kind of quiet that makes soldiers nervous because it feels too good to last. Eddie's unit held a rest position 5 miles behind the front lines. The forest around them was thick with pine and oak. Snow covered everything. The world looked clean, pure, nothing like the photographs of bombed cities and burning tanks Eddie had seen in training. The 106th Infantry Division was green. Most of the men had arrived in Europe less than 2 weeks earlier, fresh from training camps in America. Young faces, clean uniforms. The division had been sent to this quiet sector precisely because it was quiet, a place for new soldiers to get used to the sounds and smells of the front without the immediate threat of combat. Eddie himself had been in Belgium for only 9 days. 9 days of cold rations and colder weather. 9 days of watching his breath form clouds in the frozen air. 9 days of telling himself he was ready for whatever came next. His medical training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas seemed like another lifetime. Eddie had enlisted right after his 18th birthday. His mother had cried. His father had shaken his hand and told him to do his duty. Eddie had reported to Fort Sam in July. The heat in San Antonio was brutal. Men fainted during drills. The instructors showed no mercy. They said if you cannot handle Texas heat, you will never handle combat stress. 6 months of classes followed. 6 months of learning which wounds could be fixed and which could not. 6 months of memorizing anatomy and practicing sutures on pigskin. 6 months of being told that a medic's job was the hardest job in the army. You had to run toward danger while everyone else ran away. You had to make decisions in seconds that would haunt you for years. You had to carry more weight than any infantryman, and you could not carry a rifle to defend yourself. The instructors had been clear about one rule above all others. One rule they repeated every single day: treat the injury, not the uniform. A wounded enemy soldier deserved the same care as a wounded friend. The Geneva Convention demanded it. Medical ethics required it. Your conscience would never forgive you if you violated it. Eddie had believed them. He had written the rule in his notebook. He had underlined it 3 times. Sergeant Frank Kowalski did not agree with that rule. Frank was 32 years old, ancient by infantry standards. He had fought in North Africa and Sicily. He had been at Kasserine Pass when the Germans tore through American lines like tissue paper. He had been at Gela when the invasion almost failed. He had seen friends blown apart by mines. He had watched medics get shot by snipers who did not care about Red Cross armbands. He had carried dying men through smoke and fire and realized that mercy was a luxury you could not always afford. Frank had a scar that ran from his left ear to his collarbone. A German bayonet in Tunisia. The man who gave him that scar had been wounded. Frank had walked past him, had left him bleeding in the sand. Frank told Eddie the story on their second day together. No regret in his voice, no shame, just a flat recitation of facts. The German would have killed me if he could, Frank said. I do not lose sleep over letting him die. Frank told Eddie the same thing every morning, the same speech, the same warning. Do not waste supplies on the enemy. Do not take risks for men who would kill you without hesitation. Save American lives first. Save American lives second. Save American lives always. German soldiers are not patients, Frank would say. They are targets who happen to be wounded. Your job is to keep our boys alive long enough to kill more of theirs. Eddie wanted to believe the training manual. He wanted to believe that medicine had no sides, that a doctor in a white coat was somehow above the war, that the red cross on his helmet meant something, that humanity persisted even when humans were trying to destroy each other. He wanted to believe all of it. But Frank had been in combat for 18 months. Frank had earned 3 bronze stars and a silver star. Frank had survived battles that killed better men. Eddie had been in combat for exactly 0 days. Eddie had never seen a man die, had never heard a lung collapse or watched blood pool in snow. So Eddie listened and nodded and hoped he would never have to choose between Frank's wisdom and his training manual's ideals. The German artillery started at 5:30 in the morning on December 16th. Eddie was drinking coffee near the supply tent when the first shells hit. He had been thinking about breakfast, about whether the quartermaster would have hot food or just cold rations again, about whether he should write another letter to his mother. Then the world exploded. The sound came first, a whistling scream that started high and dropped low. Eddie had heard that sound in training films, but the films had not captured the physical sensation, the way the noise seemed to compress the air, the way it made your chest tight and your ears ring before the shell even landed. Then the explosion, not one but dozens, shells falling like rain. The ground shook hard enough to knock men off their feet. Trees burst into splinters. One moment there was a pine tree 20 feet tall. The next moment there were 1,000 wooden daggers flying through the air. Men scattered in every direction. Some ran for foxholes, some ran for the forest, some just ran. Eddie grabbed his medical bag from inside his tent. The bag was heavy, 40 pounds of supplies, bandages and sulfur powder and plasma, and 60 morphine syrettes. He slung it over his shoulder and ran toward the screams. His training took over. His conscious mind seemed to step aside. His body knew what to do even though his heart was hammering, and his hands were shaking. His first patient was a private named Tommy Wilson. Eddie knew Tommy. They had played cards the night before. Tommy had shown Eddie pictures of his girlfriend back in Ohio. A pretty girl with blonde hair. Tommy planned to propose when he got home. Now Tommy lay in the snow screaming. A shell fragment had opened his left arm from elbow to wrist. The wound was deep. Eddie could see bone. He could see muscle. He could see an artery pumping blood in rhythmic spurts. Eddie dropped to his knees beside Tommy. He pulled out a strip of cloth and his own belt. He tied a tourniquet above the elbow, tight enough to stop the bleeding, not tight enough to kill the arm. Tommy kept screaming. The pain was beyond anything Eddie had trained for. He pulled out a morphine syrette. His first one. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. He found a vein in Tommy's right arm. He pushed the needle in. He squeezed the tube. The morphine flowed. The injection stopped the screaming. Tommy's face went slack. His breathing slowed. His eyes stopped seeing. The morphine was working. Eddie marked Tommy's forehead with a grease pencil. He kept the pencil on a string around his neck for exactly this purpose. The letter M meant morphine given, meant the next medic would know not to give a second dose too soon. Too much morphine could stop your breathing. The time 0547 meant other medics would know when the dose had been administered, would know when Tommy might need more, if Tommy lived that long. The barrage lasted 40 minutes. 40 minutes that felt like 40 hours. Eddie treated 8 men in that time. Shell fragments, burns. One man had been standing next to a tree when it exploded. Wooden splinters had torn through his chest like bullets. Eddie gave him morphine but knew it was not enough. The man needed a surgeon, a hospital, things that did not exist in this forest. Eddie did what he could. He stopped the bleeding. He could stop. He eased the pain he could ease. He moved on. When the shelling stopped, Eddie had used 8 morphine syrettes, 8 of 60. 52 remained in his bag. He counted them to be certain. 52 small tubes, 52 chances to turn screaming into silence. The number felt enormous. Felt like plenty. Eddie would learn how wrong he was. The quiet after the artillery felt wrong. Not peaceful, wrong, like the silence before a tornado. Eddie stood in the smoking ruins of the camp and waited. Trees smoldered. Tents burned. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Some moved. Some did not. Eddie wanted to help all of them, but Frank appeared next to him. Frank's face was grey with dust. His eyes were hard. He pointed east toward the tree line. "The Germans are coming," Frank said. His voice was flat, matter of fact. "Get ready to move." Eddie looked east. He saw nothing. Then he saw movement. Shadows between trees. Grey-green uniforms. Hundreds of them. The attack came at dawn. The sun was just breaking over the hills when the German infantry emerged from the forest. They came in numbers Eddie had never imagined. Numbers that should not have been possible. This was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place for green troops to acclimate. But here were hundreds of enemy soldiers, maybe thousands, coming out of the fog and snow like ghosts. Behind them came the tanks. Mark IV Panzers and bigger ones Eddie did not recognize. The sound of their engines was like thunder. Machine gun fire cut through the American positions like wind through wheat. Men fell. Men screamed. Men tried to return fire, but the Germans had the advantage. They had surprise. They had numbers. They had momentum. Eddie's unit fell back. Not a retreat. Not yet. A tactical withdrawal. That was what Lieutenant Davies called it. But Eddie knew the truth. They were running west through the snow, running away from an enemy that should not have been there. Eddie carried his medical bag and tried to help the wounded as they stumbled past. A corporal with a bullet in his shoulder, a sergeant with shrapnel in his leg, a private who could not stop coughing blood. Eddie used 3 more morphine syrettes in the first hour. 49 remained. He wrote the number in his notebook. He had started keeping track. He had a feeling he would need to know exactly how many doses he had left. By noon on December 16th, the unit had lost contact with battalion headquarters. Radio communication failed. The officers argued about which direction to go. Lieutenant Davies wanted to head south toward Bastogne. Frank wanted to find another American unit and regroup. While they argued, the wounded kept arriving. Eddie set up an aid station behind a fallen tree. He cleaned wounds with sulfur powder, a yellow antibiotic dust that prevented infection. He tied bandages. He gave morphine to men who could not stop screaming. The temperature dropped. Snow began to fall. At 1400 hours, Eddie heard tank engines. American soldiers scattered into the woods. Eddie stayed with the wounded. He could not leave 5 men who could not walk. The tanks rolled closer. Eddie crouched behind the fallen tree and prayed. The engines grew louder. Then they stopped. Eddie looked up. The tanks were American. Missing 4 Shermans. Relief hit him like a physical weight. The tankers shared their rations. They told Eddie to head west toward the town of Saint-Vith. That was where the division was regrouping. Eddie and 6 other soldiers carried the wounded west. They walked through the afternoon and into the evening. The snow fell harder. Temperature dropped to 10 degrees. Eddie's hands went numb inside his gloves. The wounded men moaned with every step. Eddie gave out 4 more morphine syrettes. 45 remained. He tried not to think about how fast the supplies were disappearing. He tried not to think about what would happen when the bag was empty. They reached Sankt Vith after dark. Eddie would never forget his first sight of the town. It should have been a refuge, a place of safety behind friendly lines. Instead, it was chaos. Thousands of American soldiers crowded the streets. Men from different units, different divisions, all of them retreating, all of them looking for orders that did not exist. Officers shouted contradictory commands. Some units were digging in to defend the town. Others were preparing to evacuate. No one seemed to know which orders were correct. No one seemed to be in charge. Eddie found a battalion aid station in a church basement. The church was old, stone walls, wooden pews, a cross above the altar. The basement had been converted into a makeshift hospital. Wounded men lay on every available surface. The floor, the pews, even the altar had been turned into an operating table. The smell hit Eddie like a fist. Blood and antiseptic and something else, something sweet and rotten. The smell of infection, of flesh dying while the body still lived. The doctor in charge was Captain Henry Walsh. Captain Walsh was 50 years old enough to be Eddie's father. He had served in the First War, had been a surgeon in France during the trenches, had seen horrors that made this current war seem almost gentle by comparison. At least that was what he told Eddie later. Captain Walsh looked at Eddie's medical bag and shook his head. The gesture was not unkind, just realistic. "We are almost out of everything," Captain Walsh said. "Morphine, plasma, sulfur powder, even bandages. Use your supplies carefully. This is going to get worse before it gets better." Eddie helped in the aid station through the night. More wounded arrived every hour, burns from tank fires, men whose faces had melted, whose hands had fused into claws, shrapnel wounds that had torn through muscle and bone, frostbite turning fingers and toes black, men who would lose parts of themselves even if they survived. Captain Walsh worked without stopping, without eating, without resting. He moved from patient to patient with the efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Captain Walsh showed Eddie how to prioritize, how to perform triage when resources were limited. The men who would survive without help could wait. Put them in the corner. Give them water. Tell them they would be fine. The men who would die regardless of help had to be left alone. Give them morphine if you had it. Make them comfortable. Do not waste time trying to save the unsavable. Focus on the ones in between. The ones who might live if you acted fast. The ones whose survival depended on your skill and your speed. Eddie learned more in 6 hours with Captain Walsh than in 6 months at Fort Sam Houston. He learned that textbook medicine meant nothing in combat, that the perfect procedure was worthless if you did not have the right tools, that sometimes the best you could do was not good enough and you had to live with that. Captain Walsh never raised his voice, never showed frustration, never gave up. He just kept working, patient after patient, life after life. Some he saved, some he lost. He treated them all the same. At 0300 hours on December 17th, German artillery hit Sankt Vith. The shells came without warning. No whistling scream this time, just sudden explosions. The church took a direct hit. The shell punched through the roof and detonated inside the sanctuary. The blast wave knocked Eddie off his feet. His ears went deaf. His vision went white. When his senses returned, he was lying under a pile of rubble. Dust filled his lungs. He could not breathe, could not see, could not hear anything except a high-pitched ringing. He pushed his way out of the debris. His medical bag was still over his shoulder. Habit had made him keep it close. He stood up. The church was gone. The roof had collapsed. The walls had caved in. The basement where he had been working was now open to the sky. Captain Walsh was dead. Eddie saw him immediately. A beam had fallen across his chest, had crushed him instantly. Captain Walsh's eyes were still open, still calm. Even in death he looked like he was thinking about the next patient. Eddie and two other medics dragged the wounded out through the rubble. Men who had survived the war so far, who had survived bullets and shrapnel and bombs, now buried under stones and wood. Eddie worked through the debris. He found soldiers trapped under beams. He pulled them free. He checked for wounds. He gave morphine to the ones who were screaming. 12 syrettes that night. 12 precious doses. 33 remained. The number haunted him. 33 doses. 33 chances to ease suffering. After that, only pain. The American command decided to abandon Sankt Wolf. The Germans were encircling the town. At dawn on December 17th, Eddie's unit joined the withdrawal. They marched west through snow that was now knee-deep. The column moved slowly. Wounded men leaned on their friends. Vehicles struggled through drifts. German planes appeared overhead. Strafing runs sent soldiers diving into the ditches. Eddie used 2 more syrettes on men hit by machine gun fire. 31 remained. The unit reached a crossroads at noon. Lieutenant Davies gathered the men. "We are cut off," he said. "Battalion is gone. Regiment is scattered. We are on our own." Frank stepped forward. "What are your orders, sir?" Lieutenant Davies looked at the map. He looked at the soldiers. He made a decision. "We head for the Meuse River," he said. "Stay together. Help the wounded. Do not engage unless fired upon. We are not an attack force. We are survivors trying to reach Allied lines." They marched through the afternoon. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road. Eddie counted his remaining morphine syrettes every hour. 31. Still 31. No new casualties. That felt like a miracle. Then the ambush happened. German machine guns opened fire from both sides of the road at 1500 hours. The American column disintegrated. Men scattered into the trees. Eddie dropped behind a snowbank. Bullets snapped through the air above his head. He heard screaming. He crawled forward. A soldier named Danny Harper lay in the road. Both legs were shattered. Blood pooled beneath him. Eddie pulled Danny into cover. He tied tourniquets on both legs. He gave Danny a morphine syrette. 30 remained. The firefight lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, 7 Americans were dead, 14 were wounded. The German ambush force pulled back into the forest. Lieutenant Davies was not among the survivors. Frank took command. He organized the men into defensive positions. He told Eddie to treat the wounded. Eddie worked through the evening. He used 6 morphine syrettes. 24 remained. The number made his chest tight. They spent the night in an abandoned farmhouse. No heat, no light. Eddie sat in the dark and listened to wounded men cry. He wanted to give morphine to all of them. He could not. 24 doses. Maybe 40 wounded before they reached Allied lines. Maybe more. He had to ration. He had to choose. The choosing felt like drowning. December 18th was colder. The temperature fell to 5 degrees. The unit moved west at dawn. They avoided roads. They stayed in the forest. German patrols were everywhere. Twice they hid in ditches while enemy soldiers passed within 50 yards. The snow helped. It covered their tracks. It muffled sound. It also made every step exhausting. At 1000 hours they encountered another American unit. 30 men from the 28th Infantry Division. Their medic was dead. Their supplies were gone. The combined group now numbered 87 soldiers. 22 were wounded. Frank and the other sergeants decided to keep moving west. Staying in one place meant getting surrounded. Eddie treated the 28th Division wounded. Most had frostbite, black fingers, black toes. Eddie knew those men would lose parts of themselves even if they survived. He used 4 morphine syrettes on the worst cases. 20 remained. He wrote the number in his notebook. 20. The word looked obscene. They marched through the day. The forest seemed endless. Every tree looked the same. Every hill could hide an ambush. At 1500 hours they heard tank engines. Everyone froze. Frank sent 2 men forward to scout. They returned 10 minutes later, German armor. Mark IV tanks, at least 6. Heading north, the American group changed direction. They moved south. They kept moving. At 1700 hours, German infantry found them. The contact was brief. Both sides exchanged fire. Both sides pulled back. But 3 more Americans were wounded. Eddie used 3 morphine syrettes. 17 remained. The number was a countdown to catastrophe. They made camp that night in a ravine. No fires, no noise. Eddie checked on the wounded. Most were stable. Stable meant not dying quickly. It did not mean comfortable. It did not mean safe. Men with shrapnel wounds clenched their teeth against the pain. Men with frostbite whimpered in their sleep. Eddie wanted to help them all. He could not. 17 doses. Maybe 30 more casualties before they escaped the Ardennes. The math was simple and terrible. Frank found Eddie at midnight. "How many syrettes left?" Frank asked. Eddie told him. 17. Frank nodded. "That is not enough." Eddie knew. Frank looked at the wounded men. "Listen to me," Frank said. "When we hit another fight, and we will hit another fight, you prioritize. Walking wounded get nothing. Serious but stable get nothing. Only the ones screaming get morphine. Only the ones who will die from shock. We cannot waste doses on men who will make it anyway." Eddie understood the logic. He hated the logic. He nodded. December 19th started with fog. Thick grey fog that reduced visibility to 20 feet. The unit moved west at dawn. They walked in single file. Eddie was near the rear of the column. His medical bag felt heavier every hour. 17 syrettes. 17 small metal tubes. 17 chances to turn screaming into silence. At 0800 hours, the fog lifted. The change was sudden. One moment they could see nothing. The next moment the forest opened up before them. They were in a clearing, a narrow meadow between 2 sections of forest, maybe 60 yards across. In the center of the clearing, they found the German wounded. 5 men in grey-green uniforms lay in the snow. Their position suggested they had been carrying something, a litter maybe, or a wounded comrade. Then they had been hit. Artillery or mortar fire. The blast pattern was clear. A crater in the center. Bodies radiating outward. 3 were dead. 2 were alive. One had a chest wound. The other had a stomach wound. Both were unconscious. Frank called a halt. The American column stopped. Men stared at the German soldiers. No one spoke. No one moved. Eddie felt his training pull him forward. Wounded men, suffering. That was all his brain registered. Not enemies, not Germans, just patients. He moved forward before he even realized he was doing it. His legs carried him across the snow. His hands were already reaching for his medical bag. Frank called after him, but Eddie did not hear. He was already kneeling beside the first German. The man was maybe 30 years old. Hard to tell with all the blood. His breathing was shallow and wet. Eddie recognized the sound immediately. A sucking chest wound. A hole in the chest wall that let air leak into the chest cavity with every breath. The lung was collapsing. Without treatment it would collapse completely. The man would suffocate, would drown in his own blood. Eddie had seen it happen in the church basement in Sanctvith. Had watched a man die that way. The panic in his eyes, the desperate gasping, the way he clawed at his own throat as if he could dig the air out. Eddie pulled out a field dressing from his bag. The dressing was a special design. Waxed cloth on one side, gauze on the other. He tore open the package. His hands were steady now. The training had taken over completely. He applied the bandage over the wound, pressed down hard. The waxed side created a seal, an airtight barrier. The lung could expand again. The German's breathing eased. Not much, but enough to buy him time. Eddie taped the dressing in place. His fingers were numb from the cold, but they remembered what to do. Frank appeared beside Eddie. His voice was flat. Dangerous. "What are you doing?" Frank said. It was not really a question. Eddie looked up. His face was calm. "Treating a wounded man," Eddie said. Frank shook his head. The gesture was slow, deliberate. "He is the enemy," Frank said. Eddie pointed at the bandage. "He is a patient," Eddie replied. His voice was steady. He was surprised by that. He had expected to feel fear, to feel doubt. He felt neither, just certainty. Frank grabbed Eddie's arm. The grip was hard, not violent but firm, unmistakable. "Do not use any morphine on them," Frank said. Each word was precise. "Controlled. We need every dose for our own men." Eddie pulled his arm free, gentle but definite. He moved to the second German soldier. Frank stood where he was, watching, waiting to see what Eddie would do. The second man was younger, much younger. Maybe 20, maybe less. Baby fat still visible in his cheeks. Despite weeks of combat rations, he had taken a bullet to the stomach. Eddie had been trained to recognize abdominal wounds. They were among the worst. The bullet had entered low, just above the belt. The entry wound was small, neat, almost insignificant. The exit wound was not. Eddie rolled the German onto his side. The exit wound was the size of his fist. The bullet had tumbled, had torn through intestines and organs, had created a cavity of destroyed tissue. Eddie had seen enough abdominal injuries to know the truth. This man was dying. Without surgery, without a hospital, without antibiotics and plasma and a skilled surgeon working for hours, he had no chance. Maybe he had hours. Maybe less. The pain would be extraordinary, beyond anything morphine could fully control. But the morphine could take the edge off, could turn screaming agony into manageable suffering, could give him a chance to die with some shred of dignity intact. The boy's eyes were open. That surprised Eddie. Most men with injuries this severe passed out from shock, but this one was conscious, was looking at Eddie. Tears ran down his face. Not from sadness, from pain, from the body's involuntary response to trauma beyond endurance. He was making small sounds, not words, not exactly, just sounds. The sounds a dying animal makes when it knows death is coming but does not understand why. Eddie reached for his medical bag. His hand found the morphine syrettes by touch. He had organized them carefully, had made sure they were easy to access even with gloves on, even in the dark, even under fire. He pulled one out. 16 remained. Frank stepped in front of him, blocked his path to the wounded German. "No," Frank said, just that one word, all the authority of his rank behind it. Eddie met his eyes. The German boy moaned. The sound was thin, reedy, desperate. Eddie looked at the boy, then back at Frank. "He is suffering," Eddie said. Frank's jaw tightened. "The muscles bunched, so are our men," Frank replied. His voice was still controlled, but Eddie could hear the anger underneath, could hear the combat veteran trying to explain reality to a naive medic who did not understand how war worked. Eddie looked at the wounded German again. The boy's eyes were terrified. He was 19 years old. Eddie could see that now, could see it in the softness of his features, in the way his body was still more boy than man. He was dying in a foreign forest, thousands of miles from his home, from his mother, from whatever girl he had kissed. Goodbye before boarding a train. He was alone, in pain, afraid, and Eddie had the power to help him, had a small tube of mercy in his hand, 1/6 of a grain of morphine sulfate, enough to stop the screaming, enough to give him peace before the end. Frank grabbed Eddie's wrist. His grip was iron. "Do not do this," Frank said. The words came faster now, the control slipping. "We have 17 doses left. 17. We have 22 wounded Americans in this column right now. 22 men who are counting on you. Men who fought beside you. Men who will fight beside you again. If we get out of this forest, we will have more wounded before this is over. You know we will. You give that morphine to a German and some American soldier will die screaming because you wasted a dose on the enemy. Eddie's hand shook. The syrette felt heavy, heavier than it should. The German boy moaned again. The sound cut through Eddie like glass, like the shell fragments that had torn through Tommy Wilson's arm, that had killed Captain Walsh, that had turned this peaceful forest into hell. The sound was human suffering distilled to its purest form, and Eddie could stop it, could make it go away. All he had to do was inject the morphine. Lieutenant Davies was dead, killed in the ambush yesterday. Frank was in command. Frank was the ranking soldier. His orders were absolute. Under military law, under the chain of command, under every regulation Eddie had memorized, he had to obey, had to follow orders, had to save that morphine for American casualties. That was the rule. That was how armies worked. Discipline, hierarchy, obedience. Without those things, units fell apart. Men died needlessly. Wars were lost. Eddie looked at Frank. Then he looked at the dying German. He made his choice. He pulled his hand free from Frank's grip. The movement was gentle, almost apologetic, but final. He knelt beside the German boy. His knees sank into the snow. The cold seeped through his pants, but he did not notice. He found a vein in the boy's arm. The skin was pale, almost translucent. Eddie could see the blue line of the vein beneath the surface. He pushed the needle in. He squeezed the tube. The morphine flowed into the bloodstream. The effect was not immediate, but it was fast. The boy's face relaxed. The lines of pain smoothed out. His breathing eased. The terrible sounds stopped. His eyes closed, not unconscious, not yet, but no longer in agony. Eddie marked his forehead with his grease pencil. Min for morphine. 0812 for the time. The German boy opened his eyes again, looked at Eddie, seemed to really see him for the first time. His lips moved. The word was soft, barely audible. Danke, he whispered. Thank you, in German, a language Eddie did not speak, but the meaning was universal, was undeniable. Eddie stood up. His knees were wet. His hands were shaking now that it was done, now that the choice was made. Frank's face was stone, granite, immovable. You just killed one of our own, Frank said. His voice was quiet. That made it worse somehow. Louder would have been easier to take. Eddie put the empty syrette in his bag. 16 remained. He wrote the number in his notebook. His hand shook so badly the numbers were barely legible. He walked back to his position in the column. No one spoke to him. No one looked at him. The unit moved on. The German boy lay in the snow, his breathing peaceful, his pain gone. He would die within the hour, but he would die without screaming. They walked for 3 hours. The forest was silent. The only sound was boots crunching through snow. Eddie replayed the moment over and over. The German boy's face. Frank's anger. The 16 remaining syrettes. Had he made the right choice? He did not know. He only knew he could not have made a different one. At 1100 hours, they encountered a German patrol. The firefight was sudden and close. Rifles and machine guns at 50 yards. 1 American was killed instantly. 4 were wounded. Eddie ran forward. He treated a soldier with a leg wound. He treated a soldier with a shoulder wound. He treated a soldier with a hand wound. None of them needed morphine immediately. They were in pain but not in shock. Eddie followed Frank's guidance. He saved the doses. The unit kept moving. They climbed a hill. They descended into a valley. At 1300 hours they found a logging road. The road headed west. Frank decided to follow it. Roads were dangerous but faster. Speed mattered. They were running out of time. At 1400 hours, German artillery found them. 3 shells landed in rapid succession. The explosions threw men into the air. Eddie was knocked flat. His ears rang. He stood up. 6 soldiers were down. Eddie ran to them. The first man was dead. The second was unconscious with a head wound. The third was screaming. His right leg was gone below the knee. Eddie tied a tourniquet. He gave the man a morphine syrette. 15 remained. The 4th soldier had shrapnel in his chest. He was coughing blood. Eddie gave him morphine. 14 remained. The 5th and 6th soldiers had minor wounds. Eddie bandaged them. No morphine needed. The unit pulled off the road. They took cover in the forest. Frank counted heads. 79 soldiers left. 26 wounded. Eddie did the math. 14 syrettes. 26 wounded. More combat ahead. The deficit was growing. They rested for 20 minutes. Then they moved again. West. Always west. The Meuse River was still 30 miles away. 30 miles through enemy territory. Eddie walked and prayed. He prayed for no more casualties. He prayed for resupply. He prayed for anything that would make the numbers work. At 1600 hours, they stumbled into another fight. A German machine gun nest blocked their path. The gunners opened fire. 2 Americans fell. Eddie crawled forward through the snow. The first wounded soldier had taken 3 bullets, 1 in the chest, 2 in the abdomen. He was drowning in his own blood. Eddie gave him morphine. 13 remained. The second soldier had a bullet through the hip. Bone fragments had severed an artery. Eddie tied a tourniquet. He gave morphine. 12 remained. Frank organized an assault. 10 men charged the machine gun nest. The Germans retreated. The Americans secured the position. 3 more soldiers were wounded in the assault. Eddie treated them. 1 needed morphine. 11 remained. Eddie wrote the number in his notebook. 11, the word was a death sentence. Night fell. The temperature dropped to -5 degrees. The unit found shelter in a bombed-out barn. No roof, no walls on 2 sides, but better than open ground. Eddie set up his aid station in the corner. He checked every wounded man. Bandages needed changing. Wounds needed cleaning. Pain needed managing. Eddie had 11 morphine syrettes. He had 29 wounded men. The mathematics of suffering. He gave morphine to the 4 men in the worst condition. 7 remained. He marked each injection time in his notebook. He calculated hours. Most morphine doses lasted 4 to 6 hours. After that, the pain returned. Eddie would not have enough syrettes to give second doses. Men who received morphine now would be screaming again by midnight. Men who did not receive morphine were screaming already. Frank sat down next to Eddie at 2200 hours. How many left? Frank asked. 7, Eddie said. Frank was quiet for a moment. We might make Allied lines tomorrow, Frank said. We might not. Eddie nodded. Frank looked at the wounded men. You did the right thing today, Frank said. Eddie looked up, surprised. The German kid, Frank continued. I was wrong. You were right. Eddie did not know what to say. Frank stood up. But we still have to prioritize our own men now, Frank said. Eddie understood. 7 syrettes. 29 wounded Americans. The German boy's ghost would have to wait. They moved out at 0600 hours on December 19th. 77 soldiers. 29 wounded. 7 morphine syrettes. The day was colder than the previous ones. -12 degrees. The sky was clear. That meant German planes could see them. Frank pushed the pace. They had to cover ground before the Luftwaffe appeared. At 0900 hours they reached another clearing. This one was larger, maybe 200 yards across. Frank sent scouts forward. The scouts returned. The clearing was empty. No Germans. Frank made a decision. They would cross quickly. Stay spread out. Move fast. The unit entered the clearing. Eddie was in the middle of the column, halfway across. He heard the aircraft engines. Everyone heard them. Frank shouted. The soldiers scattered. They dove into the snow. They tried to dig in. The planes came in low. Focke-Wulf fighters. 2 of them. Machine guns blazing. Bullets tore through the clearing. Men screamed. The planes made 2 passes. Then they were gone. Eddie stood up. 8 soldiers were down. He ran to the nearest one. The man had taken bullets across the back. He was already dead. Eddie moved to the next. This soldier had bullets in both legs. Eddie tied tourniquets. He gave morphine. 6 remained. The 3rd soldier had a bullet through the shoulder. Eddie bandaged it. No morphine needed yet. The 4th soldier had bullets in the chest and abdomen. He was gasping. Blood bubbled from his mouth. Eddie gave him morphine. 5 remained. The 5th, 6th, and 7th soldiers were dead. The 8th soldier had a shattered arm. Eddie gave morphine. 4 remained. 4 morphine syrettes. 34 wounded men. Eddie's hands shook as he worked. Frank appeared beside him. "We have to keep moving," Frank said. "German ground forces will have heard those planes. They will come to investigate." Eddie nodded. He helped load the new wounded onto makeshift stretchers. The unit moved west again. At 1100 hours they found the ambush site. American and German bodies lay scattered in the snow. A fight had happened here recently. Maybe yesterday. Maybe this morning. The American dead wore patches from the 7th Armored Division. The German dead wore Waffen-SS insignia. Frank ordered a quick search for supplies. The men found ammunition. They found rations. They found medical supplies. Eddie went through the dead medic's bag. He found 3 morphine syrettes. 7 total now. The relief was physical. 7 doses. Still not enough, but better than 4. They moved on. The forest grew thicker. The terrain grew rougher. At 1200 hours they reached a stream. The water was frozen. They crossed on the ice. On the far side they found the cave, a small opening in a hillside, big enough for maybe 30 men. Frank decided to stop. The soldiers needed rest. The wounded needed treatment. They would hold here for 2 hours. Eddie set up his aid station at the cave entrance. He had done this so many times now, set up the same way every time. Medical bag on the ground, supplies arranged within easy reach, bandages on the left, sulfur powder in the middle, morphine syrettes on the right. 5 of them, 5 small tubes of mercy, 5 chances to ease suffering. After that, nothing but words and empty promises. He worked through the wounded. He changed bandages. Some were soaked through with blood. Some were stuck to wounds with dried fluid. Eddie peeled them off carefully. The men hissed through their teeth but did not cry out. They had learned that crying out accomplished nothing. He cleaned wounds with water from his canteen. No antiseptic left, just cold water and hope. He gave morphine to 2 men who were starting to go into shock. Their skin was pale, their breathing shallow, their bodies were shutting down from trauma. The morphine would not save them, but it might give them a few more hours of peace. 5 morphine syrettes became 3. Eddie wrote the number in his notebook. Then he wrote the date. December 19th, 1944. His handwriting was terrible. His hands shook from cold and exhaustion, and something else, something deeper. Then he wrote a question, the question that had been forming in his mind since that morning, since the first German boy. When does mercy become murder? He stared at the words. They looked wrong on paper, too stark, too absolute, but he could not think of a better way to phrase it. A chaplain appeared beside him. Eddie had not heard him approach, had not even known there was a chaplain in the unit. Father Murphy introduced himself, held out a hand. Eddie shook it. Father Murphy was 50 years old, grey hair cut military short, kind eyes behind round spectacles. The spectacles were cracked, held together with tape. Father Murphy saw Eddie looking at them. "Artillery blast 3 days ago," Father Murphy said. have not had time to find new ones. He smiled when he said it, a small smile, genuine, not forced. Father Murphy sat down next to Eddie on a flat rock. He did not ask permission, just sat, like they were old friends sharing a quiet moment. "That is a hard question," Father Murphy said. He nodded toward the notebook. Eddie looked at him. "You read my notebook?" Eddie said. Father Murphy nodded. "I did. I am sorry. I should have asked first." Eddie closed the notebook. "Do you have an answer?" Eddie asked. His voice was tired, hollow, like the words took more energy than he had to spare. Father Murphy was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the wounded men, at the snow, at the grey sky that promised more snow soon. "Mercy is never murder," he said finally. His voice was soft but firm, confident. "But choice is always difficult, especially in war, especially when resources are limited. You are trying to save everyone. That is not possible. No one can save everyone. You have to save who you can. You have to make choices. Those choices will haunt you. That is the cost of being a medic, of being human." Eddie shook his head. The gesture was slow, heavy. "I gave morphine to a German soldier this morning." Eddie said, the words came faster now. "Needed to come out, to be spoken, to be real. Now I might not have enough for our own men. I chose an enemy over a friend. Frank says I killed an American by wasting that dose. Maybe he is right. Maybe I did." Eddie's voice broke. He had not cried since the shelling started, had not let himself. But now the emotion was there, right beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. Father Murphy looked at Eddie. His eyes were calm, understanding. "Did the German soldier need it?" Father Murphy asked. "Need the morphine?" Eddie nodded. "Yes, more than anyone else at that moment. His injury was worse. His pain was worse. He was dying. I could not save his life, but I could stop his pain. I could give him that much." Father Murphy nodded. "Then you made the right choice," he said. The words were simple, definitive. Eddie wanted to believe them, did not quite believe them, did not quite not believe them either. "Morality is not mathematics," Father Murphy continued. He picked up a handful of snow, let it fall through his fingers. "You cannot calculate righteousness. You cannot add up lives saved and lives lost and determine whether you are good or evil based on the sum. That is not how it works. That is not how God works. You acted on conscience. You saw suffering and you eased it. That is what a medic does. That is what a human being does. The fact that it was difficult makes it more worthy, not less." Eddie looked at the chaplain. "But what if Frank is right?" Eddie asked. "What if an American soldier dies screaming because I do not have morphine to give him, because I used it on an enemy? How do I live with that?" Father Murphy was quiet for a long moment. "You live with it the same way soldiers live with killing," he said. "The same way surgeons live with failed operations. The same way anyone lives with doing their best in impossible circumstances. You accept that you are human, that you made a choice, that the choice had consequences. And you keep going, because stopping is not an option." Eddie wanted to argue, wanted to push back, wanted Father Murphy to give him a clear answer, to tell him definitively whether he had been right or wrong. But Father Murphy was not going to do that. Eddie could see it in his eyes. The chaplain believed what he had said, believed that mercy was never wrong, but he also believed that the burden of choice belonged to the one who chose. He would not take that burden from Eddie, would not absolve him, would only walk beside him while he carried it. They sat in silence for a while. The wounded men groaned. The wind picked up. Snow began to fall again, light at first, then heavier. Eddie thought about the German boy, about the way his face had relaxed when the morphine hit, about the single word, "Danke." Thank you. Eddie did not speak German, but he spoke pain. He spoke suffering. He spoke the universal language of mercy. And in that moment, kneeling in the snow beside a dying enemy, he had done what his training demanded, what his conscience required, what his humanity would not let him refuse. Father Murphy stood up, placed a hand on Eddie's shoulder. The gesture was brief, gentle, full of meaning. "You did good work today," Father Murphy said. "Hard work, the kind that costs something. But good, remember that. When the doubt comes, when the nightmares start, when you wonder if you made the right choice, remember that you acted on conscience. When every practical voice said no, that is grace. That is what separates us from the beasts. Our ability to choose mercy even when mercy is expensive." The chaplain walked away, back toward the cave, back toward the other soldiers. Eddie sat alone on the rock. He thought about grace, about mercy, about the mathematics of war and the morality of medicine. He thought about the 5 morphine syrettes in his bag, about the 34 wounded men who might need them, about the choices still to come. He did not feel better. Father Murphy had not made the weight lighter, but he felt less alone, less like he was the only person in the world facing this impossible equation. That helped, not much, but enough. At 1400 hours, the unit moved again. 74 soldiers, 34 wounded, 5 morphine syrettes. The numbers were impossible. Eddie walked and waited for the next catastrophe. It came at 1500 hours. A German patrol spotted them. The exchange of fire was brief. Both sides pulled back, but 2 more Americans were wounded. One had a bullet through the thigh. The other had bullets in the chest and arm. Eddie treated them both. He gave the chest wound morphine. 4 remained. The thigh wound was painful but not critical. Eddie wrapped it and moved on. At 1600 hours they reached another clearing. This one was smaller, maybe 100 yards across. Frank sent scouts forward again. The scouts found something. Wounded soldiers, both American and German. The remnants of a fight. Maybe yesterday, maybe 2 days ago. Frank called Eddie forward. Eddie entered the clearing. 17 men lay in the snow. The number registered immediately. 17. The same number Eddie had started with that morning. 17 morphine syrettes. Now he had 4. The math was unavoidable. Impossible. Cruel. 12 wore American uniforms. 5 wore German uniforms. A white cloth, tied to a bare branch, marked the spot. Someone had tried to set up an aid station here. Someone had gathered the wounded from both sides, had tried to save them. That someone was gone now, dead or captured or retreated. Eddie would never know. The 17 men remained, all of them wounded. Some unconscious, some crying out, some silent with the silence that meant either deep shock or approaching death. Eddie knelt beside the first man. American, leg wound. The wound was days old. Eddie could tell by the smell, by the color, by the way the edges had started to blacken. Infected. Fever. The man's skin was hot to the touch. Dry. He was dehydrated. Eddie gave him water from his canteen. Half a canteen. The man drank like he was dying of thirst, which he was. In a way, the body cannot fight infection without water, cannot maintain blood pressure, cannot flush toxins. Eddie cleaned the wound. The man hissed through his teeth but did not cry out. No morphine needed. Not yet. The man was suffering but stable. He could wait. Eddie moved to the next. American, arm wound. Similar condition, infected. Fever, dehydrated. But alive, conscious, able to function. Eddie cleaned the wound, gave him water, moved on. He worked through the 12 Americans methodically, checking each one, assessing priorities. Most were in bad shape, days without treatment, days without clean bandages, days without morphine. But most would survive another day, maybe longer. Most needed morphine, needed it badly, but did not need it immediately. Their pain was chronic, not acute. Terrible but not unbearable. Eddie had 4 syrettes, 12 American wounded. The arithmetic was cruel but clear. 4 men could get relief, 8 could not. Eddie would have to choose, would have to look at 12 suffering men and decide which 4 mattered most, which 4 deserved mercy, which 8 would have to endure. The choosing made him sick. Then Eddie reached the German soldiers. 3 were dead, that much was obvious. Bodies arranged carefully. Someone had closed their eyes, had crossed their hands, had tried to give them dignity in death. Eddie appreciated that. Even in war, even with enemies, the human impulse to honor the dead persisted. The first live German had a chest wound, similar to the one Eddie had treated that morning. Same shallow breathing, same wet sound, unconscious, dying. Eddie checked his pulse, weak, thready. The man had hours at most, maybe less. Eddie moved on. The second German was young. So young Eddie thought at first he was looking at a child, maybe 19, maybe 18, baby fat in his cheeks, acne scars on his forehead, the kind of face that should have been in a high school yearbook, not lying in the snow in a Belgian forest. He had taken a bullet to the stomach. Eddie recognized the wound immediately, same as the boy from that morning, same terrible injury, same inevitable outcome. The entry wound was small, just above the belt line. The bullet had gone in clean, but the exit wound. Eddie rolled the German onto his side. The exit wound was massive. The bullet had tumbled through soft tissue, had torn through intestines and liver and kidneys, had created a cavity of destruction. Eddie had seen enough abdominal wounds now, had treated enough dying men. He knew this boy had no chance. Without a fully equipped hospital, without a skilled surgical team, without blood transfusions and antibiotics and hours of painstaking work, without all of that, this boy had hours, maybe less. But this one was conscious. His eyes were open, looking at Eddie. The eyes were blue. Eddie noticed how young they looked, how terrified. The boy was making those sounds again. Those small animal sounds that meant pain beyond words, beyond thought, pain that consumed everything else, that made the world contract to a single point of agony. Eddie knew those sounds, had heard them from Tommy Wilson, from the men in Sankt Vith, from a dozen other casualties. The sounds were universal, were the same in every language, were the voice of suffering, stripped of culture and nationality and everything else that made humans different from each other. Eddie's unit soldiers had gathered at the edge of the clearing, 20 men, 30, more. They watched Eddie, waited to see what he would do. Frank stood at the front. His face was unreadable, carefully neutral, but Eddie knew what Frank was thinking, knew what every man in that clearing was thinking. Do not waste morphine on the enemy. Use it on our boys. Save Americans first. Always. Eddie looked at the wounded. 12 Americans, all suffering. Most needed morphine. All deserved morphine. 2 Germans. 1 unconscious and dying. 1 conscious and dying and screaming without sound. Eddie had 4 morphine syrettes. The mathematics said give all 4 to Americans. Said prioritize your own. Said follow orders and regulations and the chain of command. The training manual said treat the worst injury first. Said medicine has no sides. Said a patient is a patient, regardless of uniform. The Geneva Convention said provide care without discrimination. Said wounded prisoners deserve the same treatment as your own forces. Eddie's conscience said something else entirely. Said he was looking at a 19-year-old boy who was dying in agony. Said he had the power to stop that agony. Said everything else was noise. He counted again. Needed to be sure. Needed to have the numbers clear in his mind before he chose. 12 American wounded. Most had infections. Most had pain. All could survive another day without morphine. They would suffer, would cry out, would curse and pray and beg, but they would live. The German boy with the stomach wound had minutes. 10 maybe. Maybe less. His body was shutting down, going into shock. His organs were failing. The morphine would not save him, would not heal his wounds, would not make him whole, but it could stop the screaming, could give him peace, could let him die with dignity instead of terror. Eddie reached into his medical bag. His hand found a morphine syrette by touch. 3 would remain. He knelt beside the German boy. The boy's eyes tracked him, watched him, begged silently. Frank called out from the edge of the clearing. His voice was controlled. "Do not do it, Eddie. We need those doses." The words hung in the air. Cold, final, true. They did need those doses. Would need them when the next ambush came. When more Americans were wounded. When the screaming started again. Eddie looked at the German. The boy's eyes were desperate, terrified. He was dying. He knew he was dying. Eddie could see that knowledge in his face, in the way his breathing had changed. Shallow, rapid, the body trying to compensate for organs that no longer worked. He was 19 years old, was wearing a uniform he had probably been conscripted into, was fighting in a war he might not have wanted, was dying in a forest thousands of miles from home, from his mother, from whatever girl had written him letters, from the life he should have lived. Eddie made his choice. For the second time that day, knowing what it would cost, knowing that Frank was right, that every practical voice said no, that military necessity demanded he save that morphine, that the unit needed it more than this dying enemy. He knew all of it, understood all of it, and chose mercy anyway. He injected the morphine, the needle slipped into the vein, the tube compressed, the morphine flowed. The effect was almost immediate this time. The boy's face relaxed. The terrible sounds stopped, his breathing eased, his eyes closed, not from unconsciousness, from relief, from the absence of pain. Eddie marked his forehead. MIF for morphine, 1547 for the time. The German boy opened his eyes, looked at Eddie, really looked at him, saw him as a person, as a human being who had chosen to ease suffering rather than cause it. His lips moved. The word was barely a whisper. Danke. Thank you. Same word as the first boy. Same gratitude. Same recognition of mercy received when mercy might have been denied. Eddie stood up. His knees were numb. His hands were shaking. 3 morphine syrettes remained in his bag. He wrote the number in his notebook. The pencil nearly tore through the paper. 3, from 60 to 3 in 3 days, from abundance to scarcity, from having enough to having to choose who would suffer. Frank walked into the clearing. His boots crunched in the snow, each step deliberate, measured. His face was rigid, controlled, but Eddie could see the anger underneath. Could see the veteran trying to understand why a green medic kept making the same impossible choice. "You just did it again," Frank said. His voice was flat, neutral. That made it worse. Shouting would have been easier. Eddie met his eyes. "Yes," Eddie said. Simple, definite. No excuses, no explanations. Frank shook his head. The gesture was slow, heavy. "We have 12 wounded Americans right here," Frank said. He pointed at the soldiers lying in the snow, plus 34 more with the unit. That is 46 men, 46 Americans, soldiers who fight beside us, who would die for us, who trust us to keep them alive. You have 3 doses. 3. And you just used one on a German who is going to die anyway, who would have died in the next 10 minutes regardless. You gave him comfort. Fine. Noble even. But some American is going to die screaming tonight because you wasted a dose on the enemy. Eddie looked at the German boy. His breathing was peaceful now, slow, steady. The morphine had done its work. The boy would die soon, but he would die without pain, without terror, without those terrible sounds. He will die without pain, Eddie said. His voice was steady, certain. That matters. It has to matter. If it does not matter, then what are we fighting for? What are we dying for? If we become the kind of people who let boys scream to death because they wear the wrong uniform, then the Germans have already won. Not the war, something worse. They have won the battle for what it means to be human. Frank was silent. The other soldiers were silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The wind picked up. Snow swirled through the clearing. Father Murphy stepped forward, broke the tableau. "He is right," Father Murphy said. His voice was soft but clear, carried in the cold air. "Mercy is not a resource to be rationed. It is a principle to be upheld." Frank turned to face the chaplain. "With respect, Father, this is a combat decision," Frank said. The chaplain shook his head. "Gentle, firm, this is a moral decision," Father Murphy said. "And the medic is making the moral choice. The hard choice. The choice that costs something. That is what makes it moral." Frank looked at Eddie. Then he looked at Father Murphy. Then he looked at the wounded men scattered through the clearing. American and German alike. All of them bleeding. All of them suffering. All of them human beneath the uniforms. He made a decision. Eddie could see it happen. Could see the moment Frank let go of his anger. "Not all of it, but enough. Treat the Americans who need morphine most," Frank said. His voice was softer now. "Tired. Use your judgment, but understand this. When we hit another fight, and we will hit another fight, and men are screaming, and you have no morphine left, you will remember this moment. You will remember the German boy, and you will have to live with that choice. Every day. For the rest of your life." Eddie nodded. "I know," Eddie said. "I will live with it. I will carry it. But I will also carry this. The knowledge that I did not let him die screaming. That I gave mercy when it was hardest to give. That has to count for something. It has to." Eddie worked through the 12 American wounded in the clearing. He gave morphine to 3 men. Chest wounds. Abdominal wounds. The worst cases. 0 morphine syrettes remained. Eddie wrote the number in his notebook. 0. The word was final. Frank organized the able-bodied soldiers. They would carry the wounded who could not walk. They would leave the dead. They would move west. The Meuse River was maybe 15 miles away now. 15 miles. Maybe 8 hours at their current pace. Maybe more. Eddie packed his medical bag. No morphine. No antiseptic. Bandages running low. Sulfur powder almost gone. He had his training. He had his hands. He had his will. It would have to be enough. They moved west at 1600 hours. 72 soldiers. 44 wounded. 0 morphine. The unit spread out through the forest. Eddie stayed near the center of the column. He watched the wounded men. Most were walking. Some were being carried. All were in pain. Eddie could do nothing for them. The helplessness was suffocating. At 1700 hours, they heard vehicles. Frank called a halt. Scouts moved forward. They returned 5 minutes later. American trucks. A supply convoy. Heading east, Frank stepped into the road and flagged them down. The trucks stopped. A lieutenant climbed out. He looked at Frank's unit. "What division?" the lieutenant asked. 106th Infantry. Frank said, "We have been cut off for 3 days. We have 44 wounded. We need medical supplies." The supply lieutenant shook his head. "We are heading to Sankt Fifth," the lieutenant said. "Sankt Fifth fell 2 days ago," Frank said. The lieutenant looked sick. "We did not know," the lieutenant said. He turned to his trucks. "Bring medical supplies," he shouted. Soldiers. Unloaded crates. Bandages. Sulfur powder. Plasma. And morphine. Cases of morphine syrettes. Eddie opened a case. 72 doses. Eddie's hands shook. He took a box. 24 syrettes. He put them in his medical bag. Then he took another box. 48 total. Then he took a third box. 72 total. The supply lieutenant watched him. "Take what you need," the lieutenant said. Eddie nodded. He took a fourth box. 96 morphine syrettes. More than he had started with, more than enough to treat every wounded man, more than enough to ease every pain. The supply convoy left. Frank's unit moved on. Eddie walked with 96 morphine syrettes in his bag. The weight felt different now. Not a burden, a blessing. He thought about the German boys. The two he had treated. The morphine he had used on them. Frank had been right about the mathematics. Eddie had wasted doses on dying enemies. But Father Murphy had also been right. Mercy was not mathematics. It was principle. At 1800 hours, they heard the river, the Meuse, the sound of running water. They climbed a final ridge. Below them, the river flowed west. On the far side, American positions, foxholes, sandbags, flags, safety. Frank called out. The soldiers on the far side turned. They raised their rifles. Then they saw the American uniforms. They lowered their weapons. They waved. Eddie's unit reached the river at 1830 hours. Engineers had built a pontoon bridge. The soldiers crossed in small groups. Eddie helped the wounded. He gave morphine to men who needed it. He had 90 doses left when the last soldier crossed. 90 doses he would never need. But he carried them anyway. He would always carry them. The weight was a reminder. The weight was a lesson. On the far side of the Meuse, medics took over. They loaded the wounded into ambulances. They drove them to field hospitals. Eddie gave his medical bag to a captain. The captain looked inside. "You came prepared," the captain said. Eddie shook his head. "I came lucky," Eddie said. Frank found Eddie an hour later. They stood by a fire and warmed their hands. "I was wrong this morning," Frank said. Eddie looked at him. "About the German boy." Frank continued. "You did the right thing." Eddie shook his head. "I do not know if it was right," Eddie said. "I only know I could not have done anything else." Frank nodded. "That is the definition of right." Frank said, "When the choice is impossible, and you make it anyway." Eddie thought about that. He thought about the two German boys, the morphine he had given them, the peaceful deaths instead of agonized ones, the American soldiers who had survived without those doses, the supply convoy that had made all the math irrelevant. He did not know if he had been right. He did not know if he had been wrong. He only knew he had been human. Father Murphy appeared beside them. He handed Eddie a cup of coffee. "You gave mercy when it was hardest to give." Father Murphy said, "That is the truest form of grace." Eddie drank the coffee. It was hot and bitter and perfect. "Grace," Eddie said. "I do not know about grace. I just knew I could not let them die like that." Father Murphy smiled. "That is grace," he said, "acting on conscience when every practical voice says no." The three men stood by the fire. Around them, 70 soldiers settled into rest. 44 wounded were on their way to hospitals. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month. But for Eddie's unit, the Ardennes was over. They had survived. Most of them. Not all, never all. Eddie reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his notebook. He opened to the last page. The question he had written. When does mercy become murder? He took a pencil. He wrote an answer. Mercy never becomes murder. But sometimes mercy has a cost. And sometimes you pay that cost because the alternative is worse. You pay it because you are a medic. You pay it because you are human. You pay it because in the mathematics of war, the one equation that matters is not resources divided by casualties. It is conscience multiplied by choice. He closed the notebook. He finished the coffee. He looked at the fire. Somewhere behind them in the Ardennes Forest, 2 German boys lay in the snow. Their pain was gone. Their war was over. Eddie had given them that. He had used 2 morphine syrettes that might have been needed elsewhere. They had not been needed. The supply convoy had arrived, but Eddie had not known that. He had made the choice without knowing. That was the nature of war. You chose without certainty. You acted without guarantee. You lived with the consequences. Frank clapped him on the shoulder. Get some sleep, Frank said. Tomorrow we go back to the aid station. Eddie nodded. He walked to the tent. He lay down on a cot. He closed his eyes. He dreamed of snow and blood and 17 men in a clearing. He dreamed of morphine syrettes counted and recounted. He dreamed of choice. When he woke, the sun was rising. The Moose River flowed west. The war continued, and Eddie Malone, medic, carried his medical bag into another day.